Welcome back to Enigma of the Unknown, where we dive into eerie mysteries and spine-chilling legends from around the world. Today, we'll be delving into four of New York's most haunted tales. From the legendary Dakota Building, where the spirit of John Lennon is said to linger, to the mysterious occurrences surrounding the Mary Celeste ship at New York Harbor. We'll also visit the enigmatic New York Public Library and the famous Flatiron Building, haunted by the ghost of a woman who took her own life. Get ready to experience tales filled with the supernatural as we uncover places where dark history still echoes. Turn up the volume, turn off the lights, and let's begin our journey into New York's supernatural realm. Story number 1. The haunting of the ghost ship in the East River. Max Carter never thought he would return to Brooklyn. After graduating from college, he left the city to seek a quiet life in a small town, away from the wounds of his past. But then, his research into history brought him back, especially when he was assigned to investigate the strange tales surrounding the East River. However, from the first moment Max saw the river, he felt something was wrong. The dark waves seemed like cracks in the past, and the riverbank, where ships occasionally docked, looked abandoned and cold. But it was the stories of the ghost ship, the phantom vessel that people said had died long ago, yet refused to leave, that drew him back here. On the first day of his research journey, Max visited a small cafe on West Brooklyn, where the locals still remembered the strange things that had happened on the East River. Strange stories of ghosts on the water, eerie sounds, and the occasional appearance of the ghost ship. "Have you heard about the ghost ship?" the waitress asked, her tone serious. Max knew she wasn't just talking about an ordinary ship. "Which ship?" Max asked, pretending not to know. The waitress gave a thin, cynical smile before handing him an old newspaper. "That ship, the one that's dead, but won't leave." Max looked at the newspaper. It was an old article from 1892, describing a strange ship that appeared on the East River during thick, foggy nights. Those who had seen it described the ship as eerie and misty, as if it had been born from nightmares. But the strangest thing was that the ship never came close to the shore. It would simply glide by and then vanish. "Sounds like a ghost story, doesn't it?" Max said, though he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something odd in the air, as if these stories weren't just rumors. The waitress didn't answer, only nodded and quietly walked away. Max looked around the room, feeling as though he was surrounded by ghosts in the shadows. The people seated around him seemed as though they had witnessed something inexplicable, and they had no interest in speaking of it again. After leaving the cafe, Max decided to investigate the story for himself. He walked along the riverfront, where ships occasionally passed by, though most had been abandoned. A cold wind blew through, making him shiver, even though it was the middle of May. As he neared the area by the Brooklyn Bridge, where the East River stretched out before him, the surface of the river appeared like a dark mirror, without a hint of light. A thick fog covered the water, making it impossible for Max to see anything clearly, only hearing the sound of the waves lapping gently, like whispers from another world. He stopped and took a deep breath. There was something in the air, something that made him feel as though he had stepped through a time portal, into a space where the past and present blended together. Suddenly, he heard a faint sound, at first mistaken for the waves, but soon, the noise grew louder. It wasn't the sound of the waves, it was the sound of a ship. Max stared into the darkness, his heart pounding. A ship? But there were no lights, no engine noise, only the sound of the wind and the fog. Then, from within the thick mist, a shadowy figure appeared. First, a vague shape, resembling a ship, slowly materialized, gliding across the water as if it were part of the night itself. Max swallowed hard, unable to believe his eyes. The ship, it looked like the one he had read about in the historical records. A ghost ship, but was it real? He stepped closer, his steps heavy and slow. As the ship drew nearer, a chill wind blew past him, causing Max to shiver. The black mast, the cracks in the ship's hull, were clearly visible in the dim light. But one thing he couldn't explain, the ship wasn't moving. Max stopped, and in the blink of an eye, the ship suddenly vanished, disappearing into the fog without leaving a trace, as if it had never existed. He stood there, silently, an overwhelming sense of unease filling his chest. "Something's not right," Max whispered, unable to explain what had just happened. And he knew, at that moment, the story he was now involved in was no longer just about historical research. It was becoming a story about him, and about souls that had never found peace. Max turned back to his house, his feet feeling heavy, his mind spinning with chaotic thoughts. He had never believed in the supernatural, but perhaps something on the East River was waiting for him. Something he couldn't escape, something he couldn't explain. This ghost ship wasn't just a story, it was a reality, and Max Carter couldn't walk away. Max Carter woke up the next morning with a feeling of frustration and confusion clouding his mind. His sleep had been restless, unsettled, filled with blurry images of the ship and strange sounds echoing through the foggy night. But the thing that troubled him most was the sense that he had entered another world, a world not of the present, but of the past. And he knew it was inevitable. The ghost ship story didn't end there. He decided to return to the East River that evening. Despite the doubt and fear gnawing at him, it felt as if something invisible, some force, was pulling him back, as if the river was waiting for him. He knew he couldn't stop now. He couldn't just write about these strange tales anymore. As night fell, Max walked down the street, not in a hurry, just to absorb the cold, desolate air of the city after dark. The sun had set, and the surrounding space seemed to be wrapped in an eerie silence. Something was wrong. Even Brooklyn, at this hour, with the faint glow of streetlights, seemed as though it were trapped in a nightmare. The East River, at that moment, resembled a giant monster lying still in the dark, the water as black as ink, with no light shining upon it. The waves lapped quietly at the shore, and the sighs of the cold wind whispered through the gaps between the surrounding buildings. Max stopped and gazed into the darkness ahead, and then he heard it, a sound, strange, echoing from somewhere in the night, from somewhere on the river. First, it sounded like the noise of a ship, faintly as if it were a sound coming from a distant past, as though the ship had been sleeping at the bottom of the river for centuries and had suddenly awakened. Max swallowed hard, a chill creeping through his body. He could no longer stand still and just listen to the sound. Max walked toward the Brooklyn Bridge, where he knew he would have a clearer view, where nothing could hide the truth. As he drew closer, the noise became louder, no longer a mere sound but an invitation. Max shivered. There was something in the air, something he couldn't explain. The cold winds, the sounds, it felt as though someone was watching him from the shadows. He stood on the edge of the bridge, looking down at the river, and then, from the foggy mist, that shape appeared again. This time, the ship was not as vague as before. It was clear, so clear that it was undeniable. The black mast, the sharp contours of the hull. Max could see the cracks on the ship's shell, as if this ship had endured centuries of misery. And there was one thing he couldn't explain. Despite the fact that it had no engine or rudder, the ship still moved across the water, on a set course, like a ghost that had found its path. Max's heart raced faster, his breath heavier. He wanted to turn away, to run far from the ship, but his legs felt as if they were nailed to the ground. He couldn't move. The fear paralyzed him. The ship moved closer, too close, only a few meters away. Max could hear strange sounds coming from inside the ship. Footsteps. Not human footsteps, but the sound of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of people walking in the darkness, unseen, yet their presence was undeniable. Laughter, whispers, sounds like the creaking of rusted metal. A strange sensation washed over him. It wasn't panic or fear, but a compulsion, as though some invisible force was pulling him into it, pulling him toward the ship. He took a step forward, then stopped again. A familiar voice echoed in his head, like a reminder, "Don't go." But then, the ghost ship suddenly halted. Only a short distance away, Max closed his eyes, as if hoping that everything he saw was just a nightmare. When he opened his eyes, the ship had vanished. There was nothing left but fog and the sound of the waves. But this time, there was no silence, no peace, only the sound of footsteps behind him. Max turned around. There was no one there. He couldn't leave without uncovering the truth. The ghost ship wasn't just a story. It was a curse that had drawn him back here. And he knew that only when he confronted the past, when he faced the souls that could never rest, could he escape from this darkness. But would he have the strength to face it? Max Carter couldn't sleep. After that night, everything changed. He couldn't erase the image of the haunted ship drifting slowly across the East River. It was no longer just a ship. It was a trace, an endless nightmare, something that had been etched deep into his mind, a crack in time that he could never truly touch. His writing now felt like a delay, a way to avoid reality. The strange stories of the ghost ship and the deaths of the sailors only confused him further. He began to feel an odd connection between himself and the souls lost in that storm, as if the restless spirits of those sailors were calling to him. Every time he tried to forget, it all came rushing back, as if an invisible thread connected him to the East River. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't sever it. Max decided to go to the public library one afternoon, hoping to find some clue that might help explain the existence of the ghost ship and the specters that had followed him. He needed to understand why there was such a strange bond between him and the dead from that storm so long ago. He opened books, searched through old records about the ship, but nothing seemed to offer a clear answer. The yellowed pages and faded ink seemed to take him no closer to the truth. Just as he was about to leave, Max noticed an old journal tucked away on a shelf in a secluded corner. Strangely, this journal wasn't in the library's catalog. He opened it and noticed a note written in red ink. "The ghost ship is not dead." A chill washed over him, as if this journal had been written for him. Max sat down at the table and began reading each page, until he came across a particularly disturbing entry. The journal spoke of a sailor named Thomas Calhoun, who had survived the storm and became one of the last to live through the tragedy aboard the ghost ship. The entries described Calhoun's obsession with the ship he had been forced to work on. Though he had escaped the ship, he could never escape the ghosts it left behind. They haunted him, not only in his sleep but also in his blood-soaked dreams of the sea. They whispered his name, called to him, inviting him back to the place where the ship had sunk. Each word in the journal felt like a prophecy, describing the fate of those who could never escape what had died. Max felt his whole body tremble. He looked down and realized his hands were slick with sweat. There was a strange connection between him and this story. The name Thomas Calhoun, he had never heard it before, yet it felt like it had triggered a deep, buried memory within him. Max couldn't stop reading. Days later, Max returned to the East River. He didn't know why he came back to this place, but some inexplicable urge had pulled him here. He was no longer just here to study the ghost ship. He was here to confront it. The sky was overcast, thick clouds swirling above him, as if signaling an impending storm. There was no one on the bridge, no one along the riverbank. The East River was cold and quiet, the only sound being the waves gently lapping at the shore, like a mournful song, as though the whispers of the past were carried on the wind. He stood there, staring at the river, unsure of what he was waiting for. But then, just as he thought he had gone too far in his search, the sound came again. First, it was just the wind, but then it became clearer, like the creaking of masts, the sound of planks scraping against each other. And then, a shadow slowly began to emerge from the thick fog. The ship, the ghost ship, was returning. Max couldn't move, couldn't stir, but he no longer felt fear. He realized that this wasn't just some random event. The ship was returning for a reason, to take him somewhere he couldn't escape. Max stepped forward, toward the ship. As the ship drew closer, he saw someone standing on the deck. A man in a sailor's uniform, his face obscured, but his eyes, those eyes, belonged to Thomas Calhoun. "You will never leave this place." A voice spoke, not from the man's lips, but from somewhere deep inside Max's mind. Max couldn't breathe, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. He had been pulled into it, the curse of the ship, the ghosts of the sailors who had died in the storm. Once touched by it, he would never be able to leave. Story number 2. The Haunting of the Dakota Building. Lucy Palmer was not someone easily scared. She grew up in a small town in Maine, where ghost stories surrounding abandoned houses were a part of daily life. But when she first stepped into the Dakota Building, an eerie sensation washed over her, causing her to stop and slowly look up at the cracked plaster walls, the windows veiled by the winter fog. "It's probably just my imagination," she told herself, trying to push away a sense of unease she had never felt before. At this point, the Dakota Building was little more than a memory of the past. Built in the late 19th century, with sturdy architecture and intricate details, the building had once been a symbol of luxury, home to artists and famous figures. But since the tragic death of John Lennon in 1980, it had become a name tied to the haunted lore of New York. And Lucy had heard the stories, why the locals still said that on late nights, you could hear the sound of a guitar echoing from the empty rooms. Lucy's apartment was on the 3rd floor, a small place with windows overlooking the docks below, where she could see the Hudson River winding like a strip of black silk under the dim glow of streetlights. She couldn't deny that the apartment had an odd pull on her from the very first moment, an inexplicable attraction she couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was the combination of affordable rent and the ideal location. Or maybe it was simply because she needed a change. After all, life in a new city, full of promise and career opportunities, would surely help her forget the memories of Maine. But the moment she stepped through the door, something felt off. Something intangible but as clear as the light from a desk lamp. Since moving into the apartment, Lucy had felt like something was watching her. First, it was just a vague sensation, as if someone was standing behind her whenever she turned around. But then, each night, as the light outside her window faded, strange sounds began to echo. On the first night, as she sat reading a book, a noise came from the hallway, a footstep, then a sigh, not from anyone she knew, but from someone standing just outside her door. Lucy stood up, her hands trembling as she gripped the key in her hand. When she opened the door, there was no one there. The hallway was empty, only the old brick walls and a few faint yellow lights. Still, the strange feeling wouldn't let go. She couldn't understand it. Could it be that she was just tired? Maybe her mind was playing tricks on her, just like the way ghost stories always begin. The next day, as she went to work, Lucy couldn't shake the feeling. She couldn't explain it, but every time she walked down the hall of the building, felt like something brushed past her. Cold draft, a shadowy figure, as if the old, cracked walls of the Dakota were whispering to each other. While Lucy stopped at a cafe near the building, she met an older woman. The woman looked her up and down before speaking softly. "You've just moved into the Dakota, haven't you?" "Yes, that's right," Lucy replied, trying to act casual. "You must have heard the stories, then," the woman said, her eyes cold, almost with a hint of fear. "The souls never leave. You might hear the guitar at night, and if you hear footsteps when no one's around, don't try to understand it. They're there, never leaving." Lucy felt a shiver run down her spine. The woman was referring to John Lennon's death, which many believed still haunted the area. But Lucy didn't believe in ghost stories. "That can't be true," she muttered. "It's just rumors." But the moment she turned back toward the Dakota, the strange sensation returned. It felt as if someone was following her every step. She couldn't deny it anymore. The place, the building, had something wrong with it. The old walls, the dark corridors, and the heavy air seemed to hold a secret that everyone was trying to avoid. Then, one late night, Lucy heard the guitar, First, it was a faint sound, like someone playing a classical piece. But as she listened longer, she realized where it was coming from. She stood up, her body cold with fear, and moved toward the window. This time, she couldn't ignore it anymore. Something she couldn't explain, was happening in this building. The guitar faded, but one thing Lucy knew for sure: the Dakota wasn't just a place to live. It was a home with memories, and those memories didn't want to be forgotten. At that moment, Lucy understood that she hadn't yet fully grasped the secrets of this place, and she would never truly understand it until something from the past, the souls left behind, began to find their way back. Lucy Palmer was not easily frightened, but after 3 weeks living in the apartment at the Dakota Building, she began to feel that something was off. First, it was just small noises, light footsteps in the hallway, windows creaking open as if someone was watching her, gusts of wind slipping through the cracks in the door carrying strange sounds. But gradually, these noises no longer seemed accidental. On some nights, when she sat in her office, the soft yellow light from her desk lamp spilling across the blank pages, she felt like someone was standing behind her. She would turn around, but there was no one there. Then, just as she would look back at her computer screen, the sensation would return. She told herself it must be the stress of work, or perhaps some fragmented memory resurfacing from the dark corners of her mind. But one night, after returning from the cafe, Lucy realized that this feeling couldn't be explained away by logic anymore. Her apartment had a long hallway, the walls covered in faded green paint, where the fluorescent light only illuminated a small portion. She couldn't remember how many times she had walked down this hall in eerie silence. But that day, as she passed, a whisper echoed, delicate like a wave lapping the shore. "Lucy, Lucy." She froze, her breath caught in her chest for a moment, then found herself unable to move, unable to think. Her name clearly, every syllable rang out in the dark. Then, the whisper continued, no longer just a soft murmur. "Lucy, have you come? Did you hear me?" She turned around, not because she wanted to, but because an invisible force seemed to pull her toward the source of the sound. The hallway was empty. No one, no sign of anyone having been there. She tensed, frozen in a silence filled with dread. Her heart pounded loudly in her chest, each beat like a heavy thud against the still air, making it feel as though the space around her was closing in. Something was lurking in this apartment, something she couldn't touch, but could feel clearly. She pressed her hand against the wall, trying to steady herself, resisting the urge to flee. The sensation, like someone standing behind her, was clearer than ever. Footsteps, this time not from someone outside in the hallway, but from her own feet, walking on the creaky wooden floor. But when she turned around, there was nothing but darkness and a cold wall, as though the building itself had become something alive, a creature breathing, watching, waiting for her. "Do you really want to know?" The whisper came again. From behind her, Lucy blinked, stunned, only to see the dim light from the desk lamp flicker in the air. No one, just her, alone in the room, with the feeling that the walls around her were listening to her every breath. The next morning, as she walked down the stairs, Lucy decided she would not let these sensations take over her. She wasn't someone who believed in ghosts, and she didn't have time to dwell on rumors about Lennon's death or restless souls. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she couldn't escape these events. The Dakota, once a symbol of luxury, was now just a shadow of the past. And everyone, those old residents, the ones who stayed, shared the same opinion. This building was not normal. One day, while drinking coffee at a nearby cafe, Lucy met an elderly woman. The woman looked at her with cold eyes, half warning, half implying something she didn't dare to say. "You've just moved in, haven't you?" she asked, her voice soft but betraying a sense of unease. "This building, it has a history you won't forget." "What history?" Lucy asked, though deep down she already felt some doubt. She tried to remain calm. "You'll find out. The people who live there, they can't leave." The woman said, her eyes becoming clouded with some kind of fog, and a faint smile flickered on her lips. "At night, if you hear the guitar, don't look for it. You won't like what you find. It's just gossip," Lucy replied, forcing a smile to push away the tension building inside her. The woman didn't respond, only continued to look at her silently. Lucy felt like she had been awakened to something she couldn't fully understand. She returned to the Dakota, filled with unease and confusion. The shadows in the hallways seemed deeper, and strange sounds began to emerge every time night fell. But that day, something changed. She heard it again. The guitar, soft and gentle, echoing from the dark hallway. It wasn't the sound of someone playing in the next room. It came from somewhere else, farther, deeper, as if from another time. And Lucy knew there was no turning back now. This building had started to touch her, and it wasn't going to let her go easily. Lucy Palmer woke up in a night she couldn't even remember. A night too long, too silent, too strange. She found herself awake in the darkness of her room, her body frozen, even though the temperature was not cold. She could feel the chill not from outside, but from within, as though a cold wind was invading her heart. The night outside her window was no ordinary darkness. It was thick and oppressive, as if all of New York City had disappeared, leaving her alone in this apartment, facing something beyond comprehension. She had heard the guitar again, but this time, it was not from the hallway. No, it came from somewhere deep within the building, as though it emanated from the very walls. From the foundation of the Dakota, the music played, steady and low, each note ringing out slowly, like a call. She tried to stand, but her limbs wouldn't move. Her mind spun, everything spinning too quickly, like being caught in an uncontrollable vortex. It felt as though someone was watching her every move, from a place she couldn't see, from some other dimension. When she stepped out of bed, the light from her desk lamp still flickered faintly, as though something outside was interfering. She moved slowly, one step at a time, toward the hallway. The guitar's sound echoed, but now it was clearer than ever, like a light in the dark, like an invitation she couldn't refuse. She stood facing the living room door, where the light from outside filtered in. But now, the room was no longer the safe space she once thought it was. It felt as if something was waiting, as though someone stood behind the walls, listening to every breath she took. That feeling of being watched was so strong, so overwhelming. She couldn't take it anymore. She rushed out into the hallway, each step heavy, as if the walls themselves were pressing down on her. Each breath she took echoed like wind blowing through a crack in the door, as if something invisible had a firm hold on her mind. But then, at the end of the hall, she saw a dim light, pale yellow glow, coming from a crack in a door. She moved closer, her hands trembling, and opened it. Inside, it wasn't the simple living room she had expected. No, this room was empty. All the furniture was gone. No couches, no paintings, no warm golden light. Instead, the walls were cracked, and in the center of the room stood an old guitar, the strings broken, yet still producing faint, indistinct sounds, like whispers. She stepped inside, and that's when she realized she was not alone. The darkness in the room seemed to rise from the floor, like ghosts that had come to life from the building's memories. Faces without features, faceless visages. But she knew they were watching her. They were observing every movement she made. "Lucy," a low voice echoed, coming from somewhere in the darkness. She turned around, and in that moment, she saw a shadowy figure, a man in black standing quietly in the corner of the room. His face was unclear, but she felt his eyes boring into her. Her heart tightened. She wanted to turn and run out of the room, but her legs wouldn't move. She could only stand there, looking at something she couldn't understand, a part of the building's history, part of this place, that she couldn't escape. The man, or the shadow of him, chuckled softly, a dry, hollow laugh, like a sob stifled. "You'll never leave," the voice said again. "We've been waiting for you." A chill ran down her spine, and every hair on her head stood on end. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Everything around her was dark. The walls seemed to close in, and the light from the desk lamp dimmed. "We've been waiting for you," the voice came again, this time from behind her. Lucy turned around, but it wasn't the familiar room anymore. It wasn't the walls of her apartment. It was a strange, vast, dark space where wandering souls were trapped, where voices echoed from another time. She realized the building, these walls, were not normal. This was a house of memories, of souls trapped and unable to move on, and all of them were pulling her down. They didn't want her to leave. They didn't want her to leave this place. "We never leave." The man's laugh rang out again, making her heart feel as though it were shattering. When Lucy finally managed to run, when she bolted out of that room, she wasn't just running from the building. She was running from herself. She couldn't look back. She couldn't. But that night, as she hid under her covers, the light outside the apartment seemed to glow once more, and the guitar played on, slow and steady, as though still beckoning her, an invitation she couldn't refuse. Story number 3. The Ghost of the Brooklyn Bridge. The Brooklyn Bridge was not just a famous architectural marvel, but also a symbol intertwined with New York's history and its mysterious stories. Alex Ramirez could never have imagined that his job maintaining the Brooklyn Bridge would lead him on a haunting and terrifying journey. As a young, enthusiastic, and curious engineer, Alex had always been passionate about classic architectural structures and the historical tales behind them. When he was assigned to manage the Brooklyn Bridge maintenance project, he thought it would be a fantastic opportunity to prove himself in the field. New York City at midnight, the bright neon lights reflecting off the waters of the East River, creating a shimmering yet mysterious scene. The Brooklyn Bridge, with its majestic appearance and towering steel pillars, stood like a steel-clad monster in the heart of the city. But behind its beauty lay eerie stories that Alex had never heard before. On his first night working late on the Brooklyn Bridge, Alex walked through the large iron gates, feeling the chill of the night air. His footsteps echoed across the empty bridge, accompanied only by the sound of the wind and the dim light from the street lamps. A sense of loneliness spread through his mind, but he was determined to focus on his work. While inspecting the electrical system in the central part of the bridge, Alex heard a strange noise from ahead, a soft knocking sound, as if someone was tapping on the meeting room door in the empty conference room. He paused, listening intently. There was no one else around, but the knocking continued, steady and relentless. He decided to investigate the source of the knocking. His flashlight illuminated the long hallways and empty rooms as he walked. Finally, he stood before the large conference room door, where a faint light shone from inside. He approached, his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached for the door handle, he felt a cold gust of wind blow past him, making his hand tremble. "Don't open the door," a whisper echoed from inside, startling him. Alex stood still, trying to control himself, but his curiosity overcame his fear. He carefully opened the door and stepped into the conference room. The room was empty, with only a large table in the center and a few old chairs around it. What astonished him was the shadowy figure of an elderly man standing silently in the corner of the room, wearing old, worn-out work clothes, his hollow eyes staring directly at him. The figure didn't speak, just stood there, as if waiting for someone. Alex felt a cold breeze sweep through him, causing the hairs on his head to stand on end. He took a step back, trying to find a way out of the room, but his legs felt like they were glued to the floor. The man's hollow eyes seemed to penetrate his soul, carrying pain and despair that couldn't be voiced. "My name is Thomas O'Leary," the weak voice echoed, not from the man's mouth but from the surrounding space. Alex shook his head, trying to convince himself that it was just a product of his imagination. But the sounds and sensations were undeniably real. "Thomas O'Leary, one of the construction workers of the Brooklyn Bridge, had died mysteriously during the building process in the late 19th century. According to legend, his spirit couldn't find peace and continued to wander the bridge on dark nights, leaving traces of loss and sorrow. "I need help," the voice echoed again, heavy and emotional. Alex felt a deep sense of sympathy for the lost man, but he couldn't shake off the fear as he faced this supernatural phenomenon. He stepped closer, trying to understand what the man was trying to convey. The old books on the conference table began to flutter, as if someone was trying to grab them. Alex picked up a book and opened it. The classical lines began to appear, recounting the story of Thomas O'Leary's sacrifice and pain. "If you want me to rest, you must help me decode the secrets I've left behind." The words seemed like an invitation, an unavoidable mission. Alex realized that to understand Thomas's presence and help his spirit find peace, he had to uncover the secrets behind this mysterious event. But did he have the courage and strength to face what awaited him on the Brooklyn Bridge? Nora knew that the journey to uncover the secrets of the Brooklyn Bridge was just beginning, and she would have to face unimaginable challenges. The ghost of Thomas O'Leary was not just a supernatural phenomenon, but a plea for help from the past, requiring bravery and determination to free this trapped spirit. In the nights that followed, the Brooklyn Bridge became something entirely different from anything Alex Ramirez had ever known. Alex couldn't stop thinking about his strange encounter with the ghost of Thomas O'Leary. Every time night fell, he felt his presence, a shadow that couldn't be seen but was always there, watching his every step on the Brooklyn Bridge. Whispers from the past echoed in his mind, demanding his attention and answers. The next morning, the sunlight shone through the steel pillars of the Brooklyn Bridge, but the light wasn't enough to dispel the unease in Alex's heart. He decided he needed to understand more about Thomas O'Leary and the secrets he had left behind. With a strong sense of determination, he began diving deeper into historical records and old construction notes about the Brooklyn Bridge. In his search, Alex discovered that Thomas O'Leary wasn't just a regular worker. He was known for his dedication and had an extensive knowledge of the bridge's structure. However, near the end of the construction process, Thomas had uncovered a serious issue with the design that no one dared to speak of. Old records from the Flatiron Building's library, where Thomas had worked before transferring to the Brooklyn Bridge project, revealed that he had found a dangerous flaw that could lead to a catastrophic disaster if not corrected in time. These discoveries only added to the mounting tension in Alex's mind. He realized that Thomas's ghost wasn't just a wandering spirit, but a warning about the hidden risks the Brooklyn Bridge was facing. If these secrets weren't solved, not only would Alex's life be at risk, but thousands of others would be in danger as well. One night, as a fierce storm battered Manhattan, the supernatural occurrences on the Brooklyn Bridge grew stronger than ever. The wind howled through the steel beams, shaking the very structure of the bridge. The lights flickered on and off erratically, casting eerie shadows and revealing ghostly images in the mist. In the midst of the storm, Alex decided it was time to confront Thomas O'Leary's ghost directly. Armed with the documents he had researched and a powerful flashlight, he made his way into the old construction areas of the Brooklyn Bridge, where Thomas had worked. The wide, dark corridors were illuminated only by the faint glow of his flashlight. As he ventured deeper into the bridge, strange noises began to echo around him. The sound of soft footsteps, whispering voices with no clear source, and the feeling that someone was quietly following him from behind. Alex tried to stay calm, but with each step, his fear intensified. Suddenly, the light from his flashlight flickered out, and before him appeared the shadowy figure of Thomas O'Leary. The man, wearing old, worn-out work clothes, stared at Alex with hollow eyes, his expression filled with an indescribable pain. "Did you come here to help me?" The weak voice echoed from the ghost, like a desperate cry for help. Alex shook his head, trying to maintain composure. "I need to understand what happened. Thomas, I need to help you." And the Brooklyn Bridge. Thomas moved closer, and the pages in his hands began to tremble. He opened an old notebook and began writing new lines. Messages from the past. There's a flaw in the design, a dangerous flaw. If it's not fixed, it will cause a disaster. Alex realized that he wasn't just facing a spirit, but a dark truth that Thomas had been trying to protect. He began asking questions, trying to figure out how to fix the flaw Thomas had discovered. But every time he asked, the supernatural phenomena grew stronger, books opening by themselves, strange sounds from the empty space, and the undeniable presence of Thomas. You must find a way to fix this design, or not only you but the entire structure will be at risk, Thomas said, his voice full of worry. Alex felt an immense weight of responsibility fall on his shoulders. He knew he wasn't just helping a trapped spirit. He was trying to prevent a potential disaster that could harm thousands of lives. But did he have the strength and knowledge to confront these dark secrets? Before he could answer, the wind howled louder than ever, and the light from his flashlight suddenly flickered. Shadowy figures appeared around him, and Thomas's ghost began to fade from sight, leaving Alex standing alone in the vast, dark corridor of the Brooklyn Bridge. Time is running out. Alex, find the truth, and find it quickly. Thomas's final message echoed before the ghost disappeared completely. Alex stood there, his heart filled with both resolve and fear. He knew that his journey was just beginning, and he would face even more challenges in unraveling the dark secrets of the Brooklyn Bridge. But he couldn't turn back, couldn't abandon the task he had taken on. The Brooklyn Bridge was more than just an architectural marvel. It was a symbol of resilience and strength, and Alex was determined to protect it from the threats that lurked in the shadows. Alex stood alone in the vast corridor of the Brooklyn Bridge, his heart full of determination and fear. He knew he was stepping into a dangerous journey, where the past and present merged together to create a world full of mystery and terror. But he also knew he couldn't give up, couldn't let the Brooklyn Bridge sink into darkness without doing something. The story of Thomas O'Leary and the dark secrets of the Brooklyn Bridge was just beginning, and Alex had to face everything ahead to protect the bridge and those around him from a looming disaster. The storm continued to pour down on Manhattan with unrelenting force, as if nature itself was joining the battle between Alex and the ghost of Thomas O'Leary. Alex Ramirez stood before the Brooklyn Bridge, filled with both determination and an indescribable fear. The towering steel pillars and the vast span of the bridge felt like a fortress. But on this stormy night, it had become a battlefield between the present and the past. He remembered Thomas O'Leary's warning and realized that time was not on his side. "I have to do this," Alex whispered to himself. Stepping into the cold space of the bridge, the wind howled fiercely, causing his footsteps to echo on the empty span. The whispers from the past still reverberated in his mind, but he refused to let them shake his resolve. He knew he was embarking on a journey from which there would be no turning back, a place where life and death intertwined. He slowly moved toward the center of the bridge, where Thomas had once worked and where the dark secrets of the past were hidden. The beam of his flashlight flickered across the steel pillars and cables, illuminating details he had never noticed before. A strange noise echoed, like a heavy door slamming shut, making him jump. But when he turned around, there was nothing but the terrifying silence. "This is where we have to fix it," Alex muttered to himself as he entered a small room situated within the bridge. Inside, he found an old wooden desk, a burnt-out oil lamp, and several old documents, just like the ones Thomas had left behind. He began rifling through the papers, searching for clues to unravel what Thomas had tried to protect. Suddenly, the light from his flashlight began to flicker, and the papers in his hands trembled. On one of the pages were handwritten words, clear and urgent. "To free me, a ritual must be performed where light and darkness intersect. But remember, every action comes with a cost." A chill ran down Alex's spine. He realized that he would need to perform an ancient ritual to release Thomas's spirit and protect the Brooklyn Bridge from eternal haunting. But did he have the courage and strength to do it? "I have no other choice," he whispered, beginning to prepare for the ritual. He recalled the instructions from Thomas's journal, the incantations and symbols necessary to perform the ceremony. He started drawing the symbols on the bridge's surface, using the old ink Thomas had left behind in the documents. As he completed the symbols, a powerful gust of wind blew through, making the markings faintly glow. The whispers of the spirits around him grew louder, creating a chaotic sound like a psychological storm. Alex felt himself being pulled between two worlds, where light and darkness converged, forming a doorway to either salvation or destruction. "Stay calm," he reminded himself, closing his eyes and beginning to recite the incantations from Thomas's journal. His voice echoed clearly in the vast space of the bridge, each word like a call to the spirits of the past. But just before he could finish the ritual, an overwhelming force began to push him back. The ghosts surrounding him began to whirl, creating a violent vortex, trying to prevent him from completing his task. Alex felt an invisible power pulling him into the darkness, making it harder to keep his focus. "No, I will not give up," Alex shouted, struggling to maintain his concentration and finish the ritual. He continued reading the words, each one strengthening his resolve. The symbols on the bridge began to glow brighter, forming a solid barrier between light and shadow. Finally, with the strongest gust of wind, the ghosts began to dissipate, and silence returned to the vast expanse of the Brooklyn Bridge. Alex took a deep breath, feeling peace settle in his chest. He knew he had succeeded, but at what cost? "Thank you, Thomas," he whispered, gazing up at the starry night sky. Thomas O'Leary's spirit had been freed, and the haunting on the Brooklyn Bridge had come to an end. But Alex also realized that he had been forever changed by these strange events. He no longer felt safe working late at night, and the memories of those terrifying nights on the bridge would forever haunt him. Alex stood alone on the Brooklyn Bridge, feeling the calm after the psychological storm. He knew he had completed his mission, but he also understood that the Brooklyn Bridge still held dark secrets, only known to those brave enough to face and unravel them. The supernatural phenomena may have ceased, but the souls of the lost remained an inseparable part of the bridge, always ready to protect and preserve the secrets it had witnessed for decades. In the morning light of New York, Alex looked up at the Brooklyn Bridge, its steel pillars still standing tall as a reminder of the past and the souls trapped within. The Brooklyn Bridge was not just an architectural symbol, but a witness to mysterious stories and unspeakable pain. And Alex knew that, though he had freed one spirit, the Brooklyn Bridge still held many secrets waiting to be uncovered, and one day, he might have to face them again. Story number 4. The Ghost of Mary Celeste. Ethan Wallace stood on the deck of the Mary Celeste, his eyes tracing the waves rolling beneath the crimson sunset. The salty breeze from the Atlantic brushed his face, filling him with an eerie sensation he couldn't quite place. He couldn't understand why this old merchant ship made him feel as though he were embarking on a journey from which there would be no return. It was as if everything that was about to happen on this voyage had already been predetermined, like a story that had already been written, and he, like a character in that story, couldn't escape his role. The Mary Celeste was no ordinary ship. After all, its name was famous for a very different reason, a mystery that had haunted it for years. Since childhood, Ethan had heard tales of this ship's eerie past, a ship found abandoned at sea, with no sign of the crew but everything on board intact. Those stories had always sent chills down his spine, but he had never imagined he would become part of that tale. This ship had a long history shrouded in mystery. Built in the late 19th century, it was originally a cargo vessel, an expensive toy for wealthy merchants. But no one could explain how it had come to be the subject of dark legends and whispered tales. In 1872, the Mary Celeste was discovered adrift in the Atlantic, with everything on board undisturbed but not a single soul present. No crew, no trace of life at all. Ethan had often heard seasoned sailors recount how, before the ship's mysterious disappearance, They had heard strange noises emanating from its hull. Laughter, footsteps, and an overwhelming sense of dread seemed to envelop the vessel, as though something was watching them, waiting. Ethan's first encounter with the Mary Celeste wasn't during an ordinary voyage. Felt more like an inevitable journey. He had placed his hand on the ship's compass, feeling the quiet thrum of strange sounds deep within its corridors. Those sounds, like whispers, felt like someone was calling to him. But when he turned, there was nothing, just cold walls and the silent gaze of ancient steel. On a morning when the ship departed New York, Ethan felt an odd sensation in the air. The ship moved slower than usual, as if it were being held back by some invisible force. The rusty steel walls seemed to groan, as though the ship was trying to do something it couldn't. But Ethan brushed aside that feeling. He didn't want to believe in the ghostly tales that the veteran sailors had told about the Mary Celeste. In the first few days at sea, Ethan focused on his duties. But as the ship drifted further into the deep waters, where the Mary Celeste legends grew even darker, everything began to change. One cold evening, as storm clouds filled the sky, Ethan heard an unusual sound, like someone knocking on his cabin door. At first, he thought it was just the wind rattling against the ship's bulkheads. But when he opened the door, no one was there. The chill from the ocean air seeped in, and as he turned back, he saw it a dark shadow, ghostly and vague, slipping past his vision within the dimly lit hallway. He couldn't make out any clear shape, but there was a figure, a presence he felt strongly in the air, a sense of being watched, as though the ship itself held a spirit within its steel. He thought he might just be tired, that it was some sort of waking nightmare. But then the knocking came again, louder this time, unmistakable. This was no wind, nor the creaking of the sea. Ethan could feel the weight of that presence, as if someone or something was waiting for him in the shadows of the ship. He stepped into the corridor and caught sight of a faint, ghostly figure of a man, his face unrecognizable, glowing with a dim light. The figure didn't speak. It only stood there, staring. Terror flooded Ethan's chest, but he couldn't move. He could only stand there, eyes wide, barely able to believe what he was seeing. This ghost was not an illusion. It was part of the Mary Celeste. And this ship, it wasn't merely an abandoned vessel adrift on the ocean. It was a place, a realm, where souls unable to find peace remained trapped. Ethan couldn't escape. This ship would not let him go. And he, now part of this tale, couldn't change his fate. Ethan woke up in the dead of night, his eyes wide open in the thick darkness of his cabin. An overwhelming sense of dread enveloped him, making it impossible to stay in bed. The Mary Celeste was hauntingly quiet, as if held in the grip of an invisible force. It was a silence you could feel, like a dense fog right in front of you, suffocating and relentless, as if everything were waiting for something far worse to happen. He got out of bed, moved down the narrow hall, his hand brushing the cold railing. Tonight, he was utterly alone. The other sailors had retired to their quarters, leaving only the steady lapping of waves against the hull. But here, surrounded by the vast, empty ocean, the loneliness felt even deeper. It sank into him, swallowing all thoughts and leaving only a nameless fear. The further he walked, the stronger the sense that something was wrong. Strange sounds, soft tapping, like someone gently drumming on the ship's walls, echoed from the foredeck. The noise, distant yet somehow contained in the darkness, seemed to break apart the overwhelming silence. Ethan stopped, his heartbeat quickening, but then a thought flashed through his mind. It's just the wind. It has to be the wind. He took a deep breath and moved on. But as he got closer, the dim light from the lamp at the end of the hall casting slight shadows, he saw or felt something different. There was a shift in the air, something that defied logic. Attention hung there, as if someone were standing behind him, hidden in the darkness. He turned, but there was nothing. All was silent, continuing forward. His hand trembled as he reached for the door to the foredeck cabin. It was colder than usual, a chilling cold as if it had been frozen by some unseen force. At that very moment, he heard the tapping again, this time louder, more insistent, as though an invisible hand were knocking on the ship's wall. "Don't open the door!" A whisper sounded in his mind, a warning he couldn't fully grasp. Ethan didn't know why he was moving, but he couldn't stop. He raised his hand to the handle, feeling a cold breath that made him shudder. With a resolute breath, he opened the door. The door creaked open, and inside the cabin, shadows seemed to take shape, writhing and shifting, as if they weren't human. Dark figures stood still in the corners, yet the faint light from the hallway was too weak to reveal them clearly. "It's just an illusion," Ethan murmured. "It must be an illusion." He closed his eyes for a second, trying to regain focus, but when he opened them again, the shadows had moved. They weren't still. One of them came closer, swift as a gust of wind. His face was impossible to make out, but he could feel its eyes bottomless, dark as a chasm, with a life that didn't belong to this world. "Run!" Ethan spun around and bolted from the cabin, but the door slammed shut behind him. He stood there in the hallway, gasping for air. Fear had overtaken his entire body, blocking out all other thoughts except for the darkness clinging to him. He heard a whisper, a faint voice calling his name from somewhere within the ship's walls. "Ethan, Ethan!" He turned, but saw no one, yet that voice lingered, echoing through the air, hidden somewhere within the steel walls of the ship. He couldn't go on like this. He couldn't just stand there, waiting for something inexplicable to happen. But just as he turned to flee, a cold hand rested on his shoulder. Ethan turned to face a figure not human, but a blend of shadow and light. His eyes were pitch black, without whites, only a faint red gleam in their center. His face was distorted, unrecognizable. This wasn't anyone from the ship. It was something else. Something that had been left behind on the Mary Celeste. "Don't go," it whispered. "It's not over yet." Then darkness consumed everything. Ethan couldn't remember what happened next. All that remained in his mind was a patch of darkness, like shutting his eyes to block out the horror he had just witnessed. But he knew one thing for sure. Something had attached itself to him, a phantom that refused to let go. With no intention of leaving him be, Ethan returned to his cabin, weighed down by a strange and heavy feeling, as if something had latched onto his mind. The sensation of being watched, the vague, persistent dread, clung to him and wouldn't let go. He tried to close his eyes, but every time he began to drift off, strange images flooded his mind. That night, caught in the haze between sleep and wakefulness, Ethan dreamed he was standing on an abandoned ship in the middle of the sea. Surrounding him were shadowy figures, faceless sailors with only pitch-black eyes staring directly at him. They stood silently in the fog, as though they'd been waiting for him all along. "Mary Celeste," a voice echoed, gentle but haunting. Ethan jolted awake, drenched in cold sweat, his heart pounding violently. He couldn't take it anymore. The specter of the Mary Celeste had invaded every corner of his mind, and if he couldn't find answers, he would be trapped in this nightmare forever. Determined to confront the truth, Ethan decided to return to the foredeck cabin where he had seen the shadowy figure the night before. He wanted to know what had really happened on this ship, to find out why these souls couldn't move on. When he stepped into the foredeck cabin, the air felt heavier than ever. His hand reached for the light switch, but it didn't work. Only the faintest glimmer of light from the sea outside allowed him to make out the vague details of the cabin. Suddenly, an old journal lying on the floor caught his eye. It lay there as if waiting for him to pick it up. Ethan bent down, his hands trembling as he opened it. The pages were yellowed, stained, and damp with seawater. It was the captain's log of the Mary Celeste, recording the ship's final days. The last entry made him shudder. December 4th, 1872. The dark wave has appeared. Everyone on the ship hears the call of the ocean, the whispers of the lost souls. They want to pull us under. I feel that this ship will never reach any shore. This is a place from which no one can leave. Anyone who enters these waters will belong to it forever. I've seen it, another world, another dimension, and they are waiting for us. Ethan felt his skin grow cold. The terror, the knowledge that this ship was not just an ordinary vessel but a portal to another world, a forsaken place, waiting for those who dared enter these waters. He stood up, ready to flee the cabin, but then he heard a faint sound behind him. Turning around, he saw a shadow hovering in front of him. His eyes glowed red, boring into him silently, without movement, but its gaze held pain, despair, and the fury of trapped souls. "You cannot leave," the ghost whispered. His voice was like waves, soothing yet terrifying. "You have seen what was never meant to be seen. You have entered a place not meant for the living." Ethan tried to back away, but his feet felt glued to the floor. He could feel the presence of dozens, maybe hundreds of souls surrounding him. Sailors who had vanished, people forever imprisoned in another world, unable to break free. "We are trapped here forever," the spirit said. "Now that you have seen this world, you too cannot go back." Ethan felt himself spiraling into a dark vortex. The specter of the Mary Celeste was not just a spirit. It was an entity, an evil force enveloping the entire ship. All those who ever stepped into these waters would become part of it, forever unable to escape. A surge of panic overtook Ethan. He turned and ran out to the deck, but as he neared the railing, a frigid wind swept over him, and he saw the Mary Celeste waiting for him, rising from the darkness of the sea. The eyes of lost souls stared at him through the mist, beckoning him to join them. "No, I don't belong here," Ethan shouted, but his voice was swallowed up by the wind, as if consumed by the night. Finally, in a desperate attempt, he leapt over the ship's railing, plunging into the sea, desperate to escape the haunting presence of those souls. When Ethan opened his eyes, he found himself lying on the docks of New York, soaked and shivering. Strangers stood around him, looking at him with a mix of confusion and concern. But as he glanced back at the sea, he saw the ghostly silhouette of the Mary Celeste fading into the mist, a reminder that the phantom ship was still out there, waiting, and would never relinquish those who dared to enter its domain. Ethan had returned, but he knew he had been marked forever. Every night when he closed his eyes, he could still hear the whispers of the lost souls, the call from the depths of the ocean, and he understood that one day, the Mary Celeste would return to claim the debt he could never evade. Ethan had returned, but he could never truly escape the Mary Celeste. He had become part of the story, part of the eternal mystery, and the ghost ship lingered out there in the darkness of the sea, waiting for those who dared to seek it, ready to pull them into its world of no return. Thank you for joining us on this journey through New York's haunted tales. From the restless spirit at the Dakota Building, the mysterious ghosts aboard the Mary Celeste, eerie occurrences at the New York Public Library, to the ominous shadow haunting the Flatiron Building, each location holds its own secrets and horrors. If you enjoyed these stories and want to uncover more mysteries, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our next episodes. Stay vigilant, and remember, in every corner of New York, there may be unexplained mysteries waiting for you to uncover. See you next time on Enigma of the Unknown.